Welcome to a new episode of the SNA Speakeasy. I'm your host, Michael Penn, and today we are talking with, the man to go to, the go-to guy for Japan-Russia relations, and also somebody who has been very helpful to SNA coverage, especially on Twitter and some of feature articles as well. He is at Temple University, Japan. His name is James D.J. Brown. And briefly, James, can you tell us how it is that you came to this unusual field where you know Russian, you know Japanese, and you're doing this great foreign policy review in exquisite detail on a daily basis about the relations between the two countries?
Well, firstly, thanks very much for having me on. It's a real pleasure to join the Speakeasy, my first experience of this. And as to how I got into this particular field, it's a question I get quite a lot because it does seem perhaps a little bit kind of unusual. You know, I'm from Edinburgh in Scotland, and yet I focus on Russia-Japan relations. People think maybe it would be, Japan-UK or something like that. But it's just really a product of my background that I did my higher education in the UK and particularly focused on Russian foreign policy. That was the focus of my PhD. It had nothing to do with Japan whatsoever. It was primarily about energy issues and Russian foreign policy. Then in 2011, I had the opportunity to come to Japan on a scholarship. I've stayed here ever since. And so after arriving, obviously I didn't want to give up on that focus on Russia, but I wanted to bring Japan into it as well. So that's how I ended up doing Russia-Japan relations. And in that regard, I've been very fortunate. I arrived in 2011. A year later, Prime Minister Abe comes into power. And as we know, it's really been a huge priority of his administration, the emphasis on relations with Russia. I think you could really say that, at least of modern Japanese prime ministers, there's been no one quite like him who's placed so much emphasis on Japan's relations with its northern neighbor.
Okay, well, that's a great intro, and it kind of reminds me of myself because I was a Middle East studies major studying the Arab world, and I came to Japan during my academic career. I studied, of course, Japan, Middle Eastern relations. So that's kind of that path makes a lot of sense to me. Um, all right, well, let's get right into it. So you've already sort of hinted to us that Abe was unusual in his strong interest in developing in some way Japan's Russian relations with Russia. So where did this come from? Why does Abe feel this mission about this particular bilateral relationship?
Yeah. Well, on this, I think there are both personal and pragmatic reasons. And so let's start with the personal. As we all know, Japanese politics is highly dynastic, that prime ministers very often have relatives who have been influential politicians. They often, in a sense, inherit their seats from relatives. And that's certainly the case with Abe. People often talk about his grandfather, former Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke. But in the sense of relations with Russia, it was really Abe's father, Abe Shintaro, who was most influential. He was a very long-term foreign minister during the 1980s, and Abe Shintaro's particular emphasis was on relations with the Soviet Union. He really emphasized wanting to normalize that relationship and really went beyond what might be expected to try and have a breakthrough in that relationship. Interestingly, even after he left office as foreign minister, he continued to pursue a sort of informal foreign policy towards the Soviet Union, and that extended to meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev when he made his first visit, this of course being the Soviet leader, in April 1991. And by that stage, Abe Shintaro was in very poor health. He was really suffering from terminal illness. But despite his ill health, he made a final effort to meet with Gorbachev to try and have a breakthrough. It didn't work out, and sadly, he died about 3 weeks after that meeting with Gorbachev. So really, this was almost the dying wish of Abe's father to normalize relations. And he's spoken about this on many occasions, of his desire to end the life's work of his father by taking up this issue and trying to resolve the issues of the territorial dispute and the related peace treaty issue. So that's the personal part of it. But Abe, like most politicians, is fairly pragmatic. And so he also had in mind that by resolving potentially the territorial dispute, this would be a big win for him politically. That of the remaining post-war issues, this is one of the very big ones. So if he'd managed to resolve this issue, it would be a massive political achievement. And then the third reason is China. As we all know, Japan deeply worried about China's growing influence within the region. And from a Japanese strategic point of view, the worry is about China-Russia relations becoming ever closer. So the strategic rationale for Abe was, well, let's build close relations with Russia. Let's try and encourage Russia to develop its own independent interests in East Asia, separate from China, and that will serve Japan's long-term strategic interests.
Okay, well, let's look a little bit at the situation that Abe inherited when he came into power the second time in December of 2012, the period basically when you came here and started looking at it quite closely. I think it's sometimes said that that technically Japan and Russia are still at war from the Pacific War. Is that true? And what is the situation in terms of why about a peace treaty ending the war?
Okay, so the first one, just a little bit of a clarification. Very common for people to say the two sides are still at war. That's not actually correct. Instead, it's a bit of a nuanced situation. The two sides don't have a peace treaty to end the Second World War, but they are not in a state of war. And that's because the two sides signed an agreement in 1956. It's described as a joint declaration, but it actually was ratified by both legislatures, which means that it has the status of an international treaty. Now, this restored diplomatic relations between the two sides. It also opened the way for Japan to join the United Nations because the Soviet Union then withdrew its opposition. And right at the beginning of that agreement from 1956, it actually ends the state of war. But after that agreement in 1956, relations were never fully normalized. They weren't actually able to take the additional step of signing a full peace treaty because the Japanese side refused to do so. And the reason why they refused to do so is because Japan, from the end of the Second World War, claimed that the four islands of what Japan says are its northern territories, what Russia says are the southern Kurils, Japan says that they were illegally occupied. So the position of Japanese government since that time has been, we will not sign a peace treaty until Moscow agrees to transfer those disputed islands. So that's very much the situation that Abe inherited in 2012. But more so, it was definitely a very cold relationship that he inherited. There had been no visit of a Japanese prime minister, no official visit to Russia in a decade when Abe returned to power in December 2012. Added to that, relations had been very frosty because President Medvedev, people might remember that he took over for this 4-year term from 2008 until 2012. He had actually visited the disputed islands. And that was the first time a Soviet or Russian leader had done so. So it was really quite a chilly relationship when Abe took over. And then, of course, he really tried very strongly to warm things up.
Well, again, just setting the table for the discussion here. Why are these four islands disputed? What happened there?
Well, it's appropriate for us to be talking about this at the moment because we're almost exactly 75 years after these islands were seized by Soviet forces. So let's remember, first of all, what the situation was between Japan and the Soviet Union during the Second World War. For the vast majority of the conflict, the Soviet Union and Japan were not at war. In fact, they had an agreement which was signed in April 1941, which was a neutrality pact, which promised that no matter what was going on between other countries, the two sides would remain in a state of neutrality. But when it came to 1945, the United States was very eager for the Soviet Union to join the conflict with Japan. You can imagine what Washington's thinking was. We're in this conflict. We want it to end as quickly as possible. Let's get the Soviet Union to join as well. So when the US, Soviet, and UK leaders met at the Yalta Conference, they made an agreement, which was that the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan, and the Soviet Union kept to that agreement. So that meant that the Soviet Union violated its neutrality pact with Japan and declared war on Japan on the evening of the 8th of August, with Soviet troops attacking Japanese positions in Manchuria, in Sakhalin, and then also later on the Kuril chain. And so really, from a Japanese point of view, it's very much seen that the Soviet Union just entered the war right at the very end. And also that point about the violation of the neutrality pact. So we've got the Soviet Union entering the war, then Japan declares its intention to surrender on the 15th of August, and the islands are not actually occupied until right at the very end of August and into the first days of September. So from a Japanese point of view, it's seen as particularly kind of painful, the occupation of those islands, because it actually came right after Japan had already declared its intention to surrender. Soviet troops came in, occupied the islands, and then a little bit later on, the Japanese population, about 17,000 individuals, were expelled from the islands under Stalin's policy.
Well, you mentioned there that the Soviet Union entered the war and ended the war as one of the victorious allies. So, what was the U.S. position in terms of the Soviet Union taking some territory from Japan as part of their agreement to enter the war on the Allied side?
There's a bit of a change in U.S. attitude between Roosevelt and Truman. So Roosevelt, of course, was there at Yalta. He was the one that made the agreement with the Soviet Union. And that agreement is set out in the secret annex of the Yalta Declaration, which is a very clear deal between the United States and the Soviet Union. Soviet Union agrees to join the conflict with Japan within 3 months. And in return, the United States agrees that the Soviet Union will regain the southern part of Sakhalin, which had previously been Russian territory, and in addition to that, also will gain the Kuril Islands. And so it was an agreement, and at that stage at least, it was seen from the point of view of Roosevelt that was an acceptable deal. The priority was not about protecting Japanese territorial integrity. The priority was getting as many countries as possible to declare war on Japan. By the time Truman comes in, however, the thinking has changed somewhat. And so we have the situation where quite quickly after the war, the US position begins to shift more in favor of Japan. And there's a strong belief, especially within Russia, that the United States deliberately manufactured a situation in which it was not made clear within the San Francisco Treaty exactly whether these islands were Japanese or not. And so the suspicion is that the US at that stage wanted a territorial dispute to develop between Japan and the Soviet Union, because that would be a good guarantee that Japan would not shift towards developing closer relations with communist Soviet Union.
Okay, that's very clear. All right, let's move forward to Shinzo Abe. He comes into power in December 2012. He's had 7 years and 8 months or so of premiership. What did he try to do, and how far did he get?
So he really developed what was a very distinctive policy towards Russia. Maybe I'll get to the most important point straight away. It is that Abe very strongly signaled that he was going to emphasize the return, the aim of the transfer of just the 2 smaller islands. So Overall, it's described as a four-island dispute. To be technically correct, it's actually three islands and a group of islets, but it's always described as a four-island dispute. But these islands are very, very different in size. You have Itorop and Kunashir, that's using the Russian names for them. It's Etorofu and Kunashiri in Japanese. And these are really quite big islands. But then you have much smaller ones, which is Shikotan, and then that group of islets known as Habomai. And so up until Abe came into power, Japanese governments always emphasized all four islands. There was debate over whether they would try and get all of them to be returned at once, whether there could be a phased kind of transfer of them. But all of them had continued to emphasize that Japan wanted to reclaim all four of the islands. Abe's big shift was that he very strongly indicated that he would settle for a two-island deal, which would actually see the transfer of only two of those islands, which represent just 7% of the total disputed landmass. So you can see that's a very big compromise.
A 93% compromise in a sense. Huh?
Exactly. And so it seemed to be that Abe looked at the history of negotiations and he recognized that, well, maybe it's a question of 7% or zero. And so it seemed that he made the decision that something is better than nothing. Now, I say that he signaled that that was his willingness. So what do I mean by that? Japan's official position didn't actually change. They claimed that they were still, continuing with the same policy as before. But that was a little bit dishonest in a way, because if you looked more closely, it was very clear that actually Abe had shifted to a two-island strategy. And we know this because he made an agreement in November 2018 with Putin, which emphasized the 1956 Joint Declaration, that agreement that I mentioned earlier. And that's significant because that agreement only mentions the two smaller islands, promising that they would be transferred after a peace treaty is signed. It says nothing about the larger two islands. So all governments prior to Abe, all Japanese governments, had always said that the 1956 promise from the Soviet Union is not enough. And Abe, in November 2018, instead was saying, well, actually, let's negotiate on the basis of 1956, indicating that two was enough for him. So that's one big part of his approach, emphasis on two rather than four. But more than that, he also included some sweeteners for the Russian side. Economic cooperation. In 2016, he announced an 8-point economic cooperation plan to boost economic ties between Japan and Russia. He also created a position within the cabinet of a minister for economic cooperation with Russia, something really unprecedented within Japanese politics. More so, Abe also made 11 visits to Russia between April 2013 and September 2019. And overall, in his time as prime minister, met with Putin 27 times. So really trying to kind of make a close personal relationship. And the last point is that despite pressure from G7 countries for Japan to join the West in pressurizing Russia, isolating Russia over things like Crimea, over the Skripal poisoning as well, Japan under Abe was very reluctant to do this. So you see here that it's a very positive picture for Russia under Abe. Territorial concessions being offered and also economic and political engagement being encouraged.
So why did the Russian side, I know you've actually written about this and been critical of it, why did the Russian side basically blow it off and say, even though Abe was willing to give away most of the game, they basically said, we're giving up nothing?
Yeah. Well, that's precisely what happened. The Russian side said, thank you very much for that engagement, for the offers of economic cooperation, and ultimately offered nothing in response. So why? Well, I think one point is that foreign policy is always an issue of reciprocity. Most countries do not offer concessions up front. They do it in exchange for something offered by the other side. But Abe instead went down the route of front-loading the cooperation, giving this personal engagement, offering this economic cooperation, instead of waiting for the Russian side to do something in return. So it's not really that surprising that the Russian side didn't really feel any obligation to offer anything. If someone's just handing out presents, especially in the tough world of foreign policy, many countries would simply accept what's on offer and not reciprocate. There are other factors too, and that's the geopolitical situation. That Japan, obviously a very close ally of the United States, relations between Russia and the United States really at their worst in many, many years. So from the Russian point of view, they think, well, can we really trust Japan? If push comes to shove, Japan will always side with the United States. And so for that reason, also, it was felt that from the Russian side, well, we really have to be cautious on our relations with Japan. And Russia would also point to issues like, Aegis Ashore, the now debate about Japan purchasing strike capabilities. And for all of those strategic reasons, the Russian side still thinks, well, we can't really trust Japan. Japan is first and foremost a U.S. ally.
And and let's turn a little bit towards domestic politics as well. One of the curious things is, although we think of Abe as a right winger and a hardliner, on this issue things were kind of reversed, weren't they? I mean, it was Abe was the softy, offering a lot of incentives and a policy of engagement and friendship. And it was the left, including the Japan Communist Party and basically all of the other left-wing parties, that said no compromise whatsoever, all four islands. What are you doing, right? I mean, why is
that's exactly right. The Abe does have this hawkish nationalist image, and in some senses that does make sense when you look at some of his views on history. But here, yes, very dovish, very soft. If you imagine that this were a prime minister of the old DPJ from 2009, if they were pursuing this Russia policy that Abe put forward, it would be criticized as weak-kneed diplomacy, of betraying Japan's national interests. But because Abe has this kind of image of a nationalist, he's been, in a way, able to get away with a policy that some would say is sort of abandoning Japanese principles. After all, the principle of sovereignty over territory is the most important thing that that a country can claim.
And how much pushback did he get from the Liberal Democratic Party and the nationalists and others? Or did his reputation just help him sail through it quite easily, or did he have to really fight to keep this sort of flexible policy?
Because he was such a strong prime minister in many other ways, because he had so much support, he, in a sense, earned himself the right to have one foreign policy that was a complete flop. So there was a lot of unhappiness about it, including within the LDP, a lot of grumbling about it. But he, in a sense, got away with it because really he was seen as an asset to the LDP, delivering all of those election victories. But yes, the LDP did kind of grumble about it. The opposition parties within Parliament also criticised it. And they particularly latched on to a few rhetorical issues. Under Abe instructed his cabinet not to refer to the islands as inherent territory. This is something that has been part of Japan's official position for a long time, saying it's Japan's inherent territory and is under Russian illegal occupation. Now, both of those terms, inherent and illegal occupation, were dropped by Japan's cabinet. And so this was picked up on by the opposition parties within Parliament, and they said, look, why have we dropped these claims? So that did require a bit of careful footwork by Japanese ministers within Parliament. But as with on so many issues with Abe's government, the tight media control, and with Chief Cabinet Secretary Suga making sure not to give too much away to the media, that enabled the Abe administration to limit criticism of this policy that otherwise was quite unpopular.
So, understanding that the policy written large was a failure, and we'll come back to that in a second, is there anywhere in any aspect in which we should, give Abe credit for this? I mean, did he? Was there any accomplishment at all that's worth citing, other than the fact that he tried and he gave it a good college effort? I mean, is there any other aspect of it that where he did make progress?
Really, if you're trying to be an optimist about this, you really have to scrape the barrel to try and find some elements of positivity from this policy. One, however, that I'm sure the outgoing Abe administration would point to is flights to the disputed islands. So there's been a system which has been in existence for several decades now of boat trips during the summer months to allow the former residents, as I mentioned, they were expelled from the islands. These trips are allow them to make visa-free trips back to their former homeland to visit kind of graves, to engage in a sort of exchange. Now, these boat trips have become more and more difficult for the former residents as they become more elderly. And so one thing which Abe was able to agree on with Putin was to run, on a couple of occasions, a special charter flight to take some of these elderly former islanders to go and visit their former homes. So that's something. And obviously the interests of those individuals should be a priority. Beyond that, though, not really. In fact, there were more setbacks for Japan, and crucially, with Russia's amendment of its constitution. This was done primarily to change the term limits, so to reset the term limits for President Putin so he can continue in power. But it included an amendment which explicitly banned any discussion or activities directed towards the alienation, the giving up of Russian territory. So basically, despite all of Abe's efforts, under his leadership, Russia's position significantly toughened, and they actually banned the transfer of territory. So really, that's a clear failure when it comes to the Abe's Russia policy.
So I get it that basically Russia kind of pocketed all the goodies and got tougher. So, at the end of the process, now that Abe is stepping aside, and we are talking, our title of this is, Japan-Russia relations in the post-Abe period. Let's move into that now. So I think we can pretty much presume that Suga will be the next prime minister. What does he inherit here? And is there any place to go? I mean, has Abe basically already compromised the position so much that they can't go back to the four island strategy? Or is it just, is there anything left for them to work with?
Well, we now know at least the four candidates' official positions. And Suga's position is continuity. He was asked directly what his policy would be towards Russia, and he said he would continue with Abe's approach. I wouldn't place too much emphasis on that, however. He's still the chief cabinet secretary, still the main spokesperson for the Abe government. He can't at the moment criticize a foreign policy that has been so central to Abe's administration. So in a way, he's a bit trapped on something like that. If he criticizes it, in a sense, he's criticizing his own involvement in the administration. So whilst he said continuity, I expect we'll see a lot less emphasis on it. I think that under Suga, he'd be likely to, in a sense, allow this policy to die a quiet death. He's not going to be traveling to Russia on frequent occasions. He's not going to be trying to build this same sort of buddy relationship with Putin that Abe was aiming for. So I think it will, on paper, remain the same under Suga, but without any of the enthusiasm. Let's take a quick look at the other two candidates. As you say, very unlikely to win, but it's nonetheless interesting because it gives you an indication of thinking about the policy within the LDP. And both Kishida and Ishiba have distanced themselves from Abe's policy. Kishida has said that he wouldn't emphasize personal relations with the Russian leadership in the same way. Now, he's also a bit tied in the criticism he can make because he was intensively involved in the policy as Japan's foreign minister. But even so, he's basically saying that Abe was perhaps a little bit wrong to emphasize the relationship with Putin so much. Ishiba goes much further. He says that Japan should revert to a policy of claiming all four of the islands. So a clear repudiation of Abe's policy. Now, in theory, if Ishiba did become Japan's prime minister, could Japan return to that policy? Yes. And the reason for that is because under the Abe administration, whilst they signaled that two was enough, they never officially abandoned four. So a new prime minister could actually say, well, we haven't changed our policy. We're simply re-emphasizing what has existed for many years, indeed before Abe was even in power.
Okay, so let's say the major picture here is going to be that the Prime Minister Suga and maybe even his successors for a while are going to more or less shelve this issue and to try and to just kind of, not give it anything near the kind of personal attention that Abe did and to let it go quiet. Are there any, however, remaining agenda items in Japan-Russia relations which really can't be, just shunted aside that still will need some attention by the immediate administrations in Japan?
Well, economically, despite Abe's efforts, this relationship is still pretty thin. And we're not talking about a huge amount of trade that goes on between the two of them. There were some improvements in terms of tourism between the two sides. They'd set kind of some targets to boost those numbers. That's obviously going to be badly hit by the pandemic. So economic sort of consular issues, not a huge amount there. So instead, we end up focusing on security issues. And that is what the two sides will have to deal with. But that's actually not so much an issue of cooperation, rather it's an issue of tensions. And there are a few different strands to this issue. So one of them is Russian aircraft in the vicinity of Japan. Now, each year there are a very large number of scrambles which Japanese military aircraft, self-defense force aircraft, need to undertake to intercept approaching foreign aircraft. Number one each year is always Chinese aircraft. Number two is always Russian. And so you have these Russian bombers which fly around Japan. For the vast majority of cases, they do not violate Japanese airspace. But nonetheless, they're perceived as a threat because they approach it. So that uses up quite a lot of Japanese resources. Japan will continue to focus on that, especially because on occasion there are violations of Japanese claimed airspace, the most recent being July 2019. So Japan will have to keep watching that. The other one will be missiles. Russia was very forcefully against Aegis Ashore, and it will be, I think, even more forcefully against these strike missiles. Now, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Abe is expected to make a statement by the end of this week, and that's seen as, in a way, an attempt to tie in his successor into his policy of being in favor of these strike missiles. Now, I think Japan is genuinely focused on using these with regard to the North Korean threat, but a missile with the range that it has would also be able to hit Russian territory. And so Russia will be very strongly looking to oppose that and to demonstrate its dissatisfaction by taking some form of countermeasures. So that's an issue that the next Japanese leader will have to deal with and try and reduce Russian concerns about that strike capability. But it's going to be hard. This is an era of very, very difficult US-Russia relations, and that also tends to mean difficult Japan-Russia relations too.
Okay, second to last question from me before we move to the patron Q&A. You mentioned earlier on that one of the pragmatic, practical objectives of Abe was to try to build up Japan-Russia relations to keep some distance between Russia and China. What is the orientation of that project right now? How close have Russia and China become? I mean, obviously they have a history of both cooperation and conflict. what does the trajectory of that relationship look like, and how does it affect East Asian security?
Yes. Yeah, this is a really key point. Russia-China relations have become better and better. There's a long history to this, really since the end of the Cold War. Relations between Russia and China have become better and better. It's worth remembering during the latter stages of the Cold War, since around 1960, relations between the Soviet Union and China very bad. But after the Cold War, they became a lot better. They settled their own territorial dispute, making an agreement in 2004 with a small transfer of territory in 2008. And then after that, they just got better and better, especially after 2014, when Russia's relations with the West soured following the annexation of Crimea. Russia was not really left with many alternatives other than closer relations with Beijing. So after 2014, we have Russia selling more of its advanced weaponry to China. It had previously held back on its most advanced anti-aircraft capabilities and also on some of its best fighter jets. It's now selling those to China. And they've also moved forward in their joint exercises. So for some time now, they've had joint naval exercises. I think that was from around 2005. But they're now doing more exercises with their ground forces, with China sending a contingent to take part in the very large-scale Vostok exercises in the Russian Far East. And then lastly, last year, the first joint air patrol over the Sea of Japan between Russian and Chinese aircraft. And so those developments really show that despite Abe's efforts, China-Russia relations have become closer and closer. But this is definitely a concern for the Russian side. They don't want to be playing junior partner to Beijing. They know that this is a relationship based on the kind of pragmatic calculations of both sides. There's not a lot of love in that relationship. But Russia, without other real options, is forced into this junior kind of relationship with Beijing. So I think longer term, Russia would be looking for alternatives. But the problem is, as long as relations between Russia and the United States are so negative, as long as we have events like the poisoning of Navalny, then simply it's very difficult for Western countries to improve relations with Russia in order to try and draw it away from China. So that leaves Russia and China in this ever closer relationship. And that's obviously a major worry for Japan.
Sounds kind of like a loveless marriage would be a way to put it, huh?
Yes.
All right. And my final question is my traditional final question, which is there something that I should have asked you about this topic that I didn't ask you that you'd like to comment on before we move to the Q&A?
Well, I suppose one thing to consider is that, I've been critical of Abe's policy towards Russia. Many people have described it as a bit naive. But if you're going to criticize, it's helpful to explore the other options. So what really is the other option? Is there a solution to this territorial dispute that another prime minister could pursue? And I think the blunt answer to that is no, there's not. I think that rather sadly for the former islanders, rather sadly for many in Japan, those islands are lost really for forever, or at least for the foreseeable future. There's nothing that any Japanese leader, I think, can do to encourage Russia to transfer those islands. So really the alternative to trying to make a deal is really just emphasizing principle. So saying those islands are ours, we demand all four of them, but that means essentially recognizing that they're not going to be returned. So I think that the reality here is that there's nothing a Japanese prime minister can do other than to ensure that he or she is not manipulated by the Russian side. Because under Abe, what it looks like is the Russian side used the false hope over the islands to encourage engagement, but without any real intention of ever making a deal. So by embracing a more principled position, a Japanese prime minister would be accepting that the islands are not going to be returned, but at least protecting Japan's national interests from that level of manipulation.
How about the other option, which is just to say, all right, well, we recognize that at the end of World War II, we lost them, they're gone, and we'll sign them all over to Russia for the sake of having a good relationship with an important neighbor?
Well, in theory, yes, there is an option. Some people might point to the San Francisco Peace Treaty, which of course Japan signed, where it says that Japan renounces all claim to the Kuril Islands. And so some people might say, well, perhaps Japan should recognize that it has given up its claims to the islands. Japanese government, however, says that the Kuril Islands mentioned in that treaty do not include the 4 now disputed islands. And I think also the vast majority of the Japanese population would not be satisfied with a leader who would just unilaterally give up that claim.
Okay, well, now thank you very much, and we're going to move to the off the record patron Q&A section.